don't think it should be how well your parents can fight for what you need.
When you're at home, to sort of at least have a safe space to come to where you know that you're understood and accepted for who you are. Today, we're talking to Alex Manners. He's a 28-year-old autism advocate. He's a speaker, he's a presenter, he's an author, he's very, very multifaceted. He goes and he talks to companies, he talks to schools, he talks to universities to help raise autism awareness and to empower the people there to truly understand autism and interact with it in the best possible way. He's the author of the book That's Not Right, My Life with Asperger, and you might recognize him from the Undateables series on Channel 4. So hello, Alex.
Hello, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to speak more and hopefully inspire some more parents out there.
Yeah, great. And we'll probably start with your life story, you know, how things were for you when you were a child. But just touch on this Undateables episode first. How did that happen? How did you end up on that program, and what happened?
So, whilst most people actually would apply to go onto the show, I'd written quite a lot of articles and about and gone on the radio quite a lot, talking about my experiences of growing up and living with autism. And it was one of the producers of the Undateables that actually found an article that I'd written online and actually got in touch with me and said, "Oh, this is a really inspiring article. I'd love to have a chat with you." And then when I had a chat with her on the phone, it was then that she told me that she worked on the show The Undateables and would I consider or like to be on the program. And literally after about 4 seconds of having a think, 4 or 5 seconds, I just said, "Yeah, I'd love to be on the show." It was a show that I'd not really ever considered going on myself, but I'd watched it loads and loads of times, so I knew all about it. And my experiences on the show were very positive. So they filmed me in a lot of the different locations that I would normally be in my everyday life. So they filmed me at my home, my granddad's house, my local football club, the radio station that I was presenting at the time. So they filmed me in lots of the locations I was in. And I'd say the weirdest thing about, because I went on 2 different episodes, but that very first episode I went on, I think the weirdest thing about that episode was the fact that the date that they filmed, which you can see at the end of the episode, was the first proper date I ever went on. So to think that not just everyone in my family, but everyone who'd ever met me and anyone in the world could watch my first ever, proper date with another person was a bit strange.
So, can we come to your childhood now and your background? And tell me what it was like, because you weren't diagnosed, were you, either, until you were about 10 years old. How was it for you growing up as an autistic boy when your parents didn't know that you were autistic and you know, didn't have an understanding of you? How was that?
I think, before I was diagnosed, the world around me was really confusing and nothing seemed to make sense, which is why I chose to write my book and call it That's Not Right, because everything about my life, there was so many different aspects that I found really confusing. For example, there was like a very slight slope on the way to school, and I wanted to ban hills because of this slope. So even like things that most people wouldn't notice, I found really confusing. So the world around
Yes.
me was confusing. And the reason why my parents decided to try and get me that diagnosis, or why they thought I might have autism or Asperger's, was because we went to stay with some friends in America, and their son had a diagnosis, and he could recognize a lot of similar traits in me that were present in his son. So it was our friend in America who first sort of told my family, "Oh, I think that Alex might display some autistic traits." So it was through him that my parents first thought that I might have this thing called autism or Asperger's, as I was diagnosed with at the time. And I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 10 years old.
Yeah. So tell me about how those early years were, because you're saying that things were like quite confusing for you. Things didn't make sense and presumably caused you some anxiety and some stress. How did the people around you at home, at school, in other ways, how did they respond to that? How did they interact with that, you know, different way that you were presenting yourself?
when I remember having a meeting at school with my parents and the Senko, and the Senko just suddenly came out and said, "Alex, do you realize you have Asperger's?" And because I didn't really understand fully what this meant, as soon as that meeting finished, my dad, he took me outside and he basically said to me, "Don't worry about having this thing called Asperger's. Lots of our family have Asperger's traits and it gives you special powers." So from the moment I was diagnosed, my parents always talked to me about the positive elements of having that diagnosis. I mean, I struggled a lot in school, and going to school for me used to feel like I was going to prison. So I knew I faced a lot of different challenges and the world was confusing. But because of what my dad told me, I also thought it was this diagnosis was some kind of like superpower. And from that moment forward, I've always viewed it as something positive and something that I honestly feel lucky to have been able to manage throughout the past 28 years. But although my parents were very positive about my diagnosis, a lot of the teachers weren't so positive about it. And I felt that a lot of the teachers at my primary school had preconceived ideas about what autism was. And to me, it felt like they almost didn't want to put the things in place that not only I needed, but that I was entitled to because of that diagnosis. So I was bullied in primary school, not only by some of the pupils in my year group, but it also felt like some of the teachers were bullying me as well. Um, and then, lots of things about school, like homework was really stressful. Um, I had really bad anxiety about being left in school every day. It was terrible for my mum to even just try and get me into school every day. So whilst my parents and a lot of my family were really supportive, I didn't feel like the teachers at school were as supportive as my family and my parents were.
And when you've got all of that going on at school, I think it's especially important to have that foundation from your parents when you're at home, to sort of at least have a safe space to come to where you know that you're understood and accepted for who you are. And you're actually very lucky, I think, because a lot of parents of autistic children, they go through this journey that when the idea of autism comes into their lives, it's something, either something difficult or complicated or negative or shameful. And if the parents are feeling like that, then the child absorbs that understanding of themselves and it affects their self-esteem. And it sounds like from the moment it came into your life, at least at home, you were given a really positive conception of it, and an esteem building understanding of what it was that you were, what it was that you were.
I think that's right. And I think, I always say that people often grow up, having the same sort of thoughts and opinions as their parents. And because my parents were telling me that this was a positive thing, that's kind of what I grew up to believe that this thing called Asperger's or autism was. Um, and I feel very lucky because as well as my parents, I have quite a large network of family. So, if ever I was feeling stressed, I always had someone I could phone for a chat, or I always had my grandparents' house I could go around to, my other grandma's house, my uncle Tim, I could always go to his house. So there were always people in my life, as well as my parents, who were really supportive. Um, and although they didn't, they may not have had as much of an understanding of autism as my parents did, they were always really, really happy to try and support me in any way that they could. And, give me a safe environment to go to, or a safe person to call up if ever I was feeling stressed. So I feel very lucky that I had that growing up, because I know a lot of people maybe don't grow up with a family that's so supportive or accepting of that diagnosis. Another thing I always say is that my dad was really capable of fighting for what I needed in school. So without his ability to actually, fight for what I needed, even though I was entitled to certain things because of that diagnosis, I don't think I would have got as much support as I did, or the level of support that I received in school, if my dad hadn't been able to, fight for what I needed, which is a real shame, because it shouldn't be. I don't think it should be how well your parents can fight for what you need. It should be, if you've got a diagnosis, you are entitled to certain levels of support anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and ideally, we want to have a needs-enabled system where the needs are sort of met in advance, so that people don't need to even make special accommodations. They're going to be looked after wherever they come from. So first bit of advice then to parents, what would based on your experience as well, what would you say to parents who were going through that difficult process for them of having this new idea of autism, which seems like just the way it's presented, the way it's like talked about by medical people, and in mainstream society, often it's presented as an illness or a disability or disease or something. How can they do what your parents did and give their children that sort of strong and positive conception of autism so they have good self-esteem?
I think one thing I always say to parents is, especially if you've got a newly diagnosed child, is to focus on the positive elements of their diagnosis. Yes, there are going to be challenges, but don't focus on the challenges. Focus on the positive elements of that child's diagnosis and the things that maybe they can do that maybe others can't do or can't do as well. Or the things that, I always say that I've got autism superpowers, and they are basically things that I excel at because of my diagnosis. And I think it's really important to focus on those things and make your child actually think of autism as a positive thing rather than a negative thing that is maybe something that they should be ashamed of, because it's not something that you should be ashamed of. It's something that you should embrace because, whilst there are challenges, as I like to say, there are lots of superpowers of having that diagnosis as well. And, there are lots of sort of pieces of advice I could give to parents, but I think, that is one of the best pieces of advice initially I would give to a parent. Like, as I said, especially if they've got children or a child who's just been newly diagnosed.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really important because we focus on the lack always, don't we? And we look at sort of milestones for non-autistic children and like speak at this age, they, socially interact in this particular way at this age. And that roadmap might be different for autistic children. Some of those things might be later. And we always focus on the things that could be later. And what we don't put the focus on are the really positive things that come earlier. It might be some sort of creative genius, or it might be, sort of the mind working in a sort of out of the box sort of way. And instead of being celebrated and seen as something that can contribute a lot, that's often seen as, something that's weird and should be shut down.
Yeah, I think that, the way my brain works is so different to everyone else in my family, and I often come out with things that, like, bamboozle my family, or things that people think are, like, really impossible, when actually, if there's a slight chance that it could be a possibility, I'll think of it. So, my brain works in weird and wonderful ways. Naturally, it's these ways of thinking that I think are a really positive thing about my diagnosis.
And to go back just for a moment to the time before you had the diagnosis, before you knew you were autistic, and you were saying that things were really overwhelming for you, and there were certain things that you didn't understand and that created anxiety. How was that when people didn't know that you were autistic? When what did they think? Did they think there was something wrong with you, or how did they handle that?
I think one thing about me is when I was younger, I was very good at masking how I was feeling. And I didn't do this deliberately. Like, I didn't know I was doing it. I did it subconsciously, as a way just to basically not stand out as being like some naughty child. Um, and just because especially in school, when I'm masked in school, I didn't trust any of the teachers. So, I found it very difficult to actually tell anyone exactly how I was feeling and how I was experiencing things. Um, so a lot of people, when I say to them, and even when I was younger, when I would say to them, I've got autism, they would always say something like, "Oh, I would never have known that you had
Yes.
autism." And then my response to them would always be, "Well, I would never have known that you did not have autism because
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a hidden disability." And I'm thinking, well, you can't look at me and tell that I've got autism because it's something hidden. You might be able to, if I was unmasking and I wasn't masking anymore, there might be certain elements of the language that I use or the lack of eye contact, for example, that you might be able to tell. But because I'm masking here and because it's a hidden disability, how are you supposed to tell that I've got a diagnosis of autism?
Yeah. I mean, I had the same. I found out I was autistic at 46. And even, that's the most common response I got. Oh, well, I'd have never noticed. I'd have never known. Um, and I wonder, I mean, I don't feel that I've been masking. I don't feel that I'm actually capable of masking, but there must be an element of it going on through my life. And, I worked in the corporate world for like 10 years. So there must have been an element of masking to fit in to sort of, but I was never aware that I was doing that. It's quite a strange thing, but it's something you hear a lot with autistic people, and especially girls, autistic girls, this thing about masking and really sort of behaving in a way that's considered normal, uh, and suppressing who they really are, which must actually be a really painful and lonely state to be in. Do you have those sorts of memories from that early age?
Yeah, I mean, when I was masking in school, obviously, I knew that I didn't feel comfortable enough to tell the teachers what was going on and the things that I was stressed or struggling with. Um, but I didn't know that at the time that was actually a form of masking. Because school was never an environment I felt comfortable in. I just didn't want to show exactly how I was feeling to people. And I guess again, going back to being that naughty kid, I didn't want to think people in my class to think that I was weird or some kind of naughty kid by having these meltdowns. It was only then when I went home that I felt comfortable enough to tell my parents what I was feeling, the things that I was struggling with. And then because I'd been struggling all day in school and holding everything back, I would have these really bad meltdowns at home. And they wouldn't be over like one little thing at home would make me go into a meltdown, but it wouldn't be that one little thing at home that has caused the meltdown. It would have been all those things at school, all those instances at school, all those instances where I'd held in how I was feeling. And it was as if when I got home, that one last little thing was like that last little piece of string inside me snapping. But I mean, going back to girls and masking, I know quite a lot of individuals with autism, but there's this one particular girl who I'm very friendly with. And when I'm doing a lot of the autism training, um, at different companies, for different schools, I always kind of use some of her examples because you look at somebody with autism like me, and you might think that that's how all autistic people experience things, but actually everyone is so different, and her traits are completely different to mine. So sometimes when we've been like working together on different projects, it's really great because I can say, well, my autism makes me do this or think like this. And she'll be like, oh, I'm the complete opposite to that. And it just goes to show when I use her experiences how different, everyone with autism can actually be.
Yeah, it's like we talk. I mean, you're raising so many important things. It's like we talk about an autism spectrum, and it is a spectrum, but humanity is a spectrum, isn't it? And autistic people are just humans, so they're going to be different from each other. And the other really important thing, really, really important thing that you raise is about meltdowns and how they can so often be understood just on a superficial level of, oh, why is he melting down? All I did was like move his pen to the wrong place or something like that. Well, that's not a cause for meltdown. But that's the clue, isn't it? It's not a cause for the meltdown. The meltdown is an accumulation of stress that's built up. And very often it happens after school. I mean, that's a very normal thing that, children are sort of holding it all in at school because it's not acceptable or it wouldn't be convenient or it's not safe to express it there. And then it can only come out when they're at home. And it's so important that parents are aware of that, isn't it? Uh, and can understand what's going on for the child and understand it in that deeper way. Did you find that your parents were, even before any idea of autism, they were understanding and supportive, or did it confuse them?
I mean, they've always been amazing parents. They've always been very supportive. I had a really great childhood in that respect. I had a large and supportive family. I think, you know, before my diagnosis, um, obviously I was diagnosed at 10 years old, but I don't remember too many meltdowns before then. It was only kind of after the diagnosis that I remember having a lot of meltdowns. And, one thing that my parents did when I was having a meltdown is they knew that that meltdown was like the final straw. Like I needed to have that meltdown in order to get all this stress and anxiety out of my system and out of my body. And because my meltdowns, I mean, if they'd have been physical, my parents would have had to have tried to stop them or step in. But because my meltdowns were only ever verbal meltdowns, they kind of just let me have the meltdown. And then it was after the meltdown that they would then talk to me about what could have been done differently, how could we have supported you. Um, I used to get very depressed after a meltdown because when I was having those meltdowns, I used to say some awful things to my mum. I used to call her, I'm not, embarrassed to say that I used to call her every bad word you could possibly think of. And it wasn't because I meant those things, and she knew that I didn't mean these things. It was just I was so stressed from the day or the week at school that it was my brain had completely lost control of where it was. That oh, I didn't know what I was saying in that moment when I was having the meltdown. So although it must have been hard for my mum to hear her son saying these things about her that were horrible, she knew that I didn't mean them, and she knew that I was like at my wit's end, that I had no other way of getting all the stress out of my system. So it was hard for me when I was having the meltdown because I was the one having it, but it was also really hard for my family as well, not just my mum or my dad, but also I've got two sisters, and I can imagine how hard it would have been for them. Um, I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced meltdowns or maybe when you were younger or as an adult, but yeah, they were hard not just on me but also on my family.
No, absolutely, and I think you were really, really lucky to have that level of understanding from your parents and acceptance, because, as you say, it must have been extremely difficult for them, and yet they didn't sort of see it as a discipline issue or anything like that, which is quite a common reaction. They saw it as something where you needed support, and they actually gave you that support.
Yeah, they did. Um, yeah, they knew that the meltdown was like my final straw. Obviously, they wanted to stop the meltdowns if they could, but they knew at the time I was having a meltdown. I couldn't think straight. I wasn't in the right headspace to be able to tell them what I was struggling with or how I could come out of a meltdown. So they waited till the meltdown was basically over before they then had that conversation with me. And we did have a few coping strategies in place that my mum could utilize or go to when I was having a meltdown, which were always really useful and sometimes used to really quickly get me out of a meltdown. So it was brilliant that my parents knew the things that actually helped me to, you know, come out of a meltdown as well.
Yeah. Do you wanna share what some of those things are? Because it might be really helpful to some of the people listening.
Yeah, so my biggest special interest is football, and then another special interest of mine is children's TV, and it was those two things that always used to decrease my stress levels and get me to come out of a meltdown. So football, especially reading football programs, always used to help me to de-stress when I was in school. So I even now I carry a football program with me wherever I am, and that always makes me less stressed when I'm reading it. When I was having a meltdown, the first thing my mum would always do is go straight to the nearest television and put on a children's program because it was like a switch flicking in my head where I would be having this terrible meltdown, and then suddenly I'd see a kids show on the TV and I would instantly feel relaxed and the meltdown would like instantly stop. So they were two things, and then a third thing that used to really help when I was having a meltdown was we had at home what was known as a meltdown bar, which was basically a chocolate bar that my mum would hide somewhere, and she would only ever get it out when I was having a meltdown, and she would literally give me just maybe 1 or 2 squares of this meltdown chocolate bar, because after a meltdown, my energy levels were really low and I felt really tired. So having 1 or 2 squares of chocolate after a meltdown used to just sort of perk my energy levels up, and make me feel a little bit less stressed or depressed. So, yeah, it was my special interests that really helped, but also this meltdown chocolate bar that we had also.
Yeah, you probably totally run down on glucose, and you just sort of needed some sort of sugar hit just to sort of get back to normal levels, I guess. And those are beautiful strategies, and really caring strategies as well. And it's like, just this way that they, um, a lot of autistic children have special interests of one sort or another. And to use those as a way of supporting you was really nice as well. How do you now work? Tell us a little bit about how you work now and how you draw on those early experiences that you've been talking about in your current work as an autism advocate.
So I really, really, because a lot of my friends that have a diagnosis of autism, they wouldn't feel confident enough to talk about the challenges they faced or their childhood. And, I stand up and speak in front of like sometimes 50, 60, 150 people, and they wouldn't feel confident in doing that. And I like to call those things, my autism, or some of my autism superpowers. And I want to use those superpowers to educate and inspire as many people as I can. So the work that I do now, I talk about what it was like growing up with autism. What actually is autism, what it was like going through school. So I talk a lot about the challenges that I face in school. I try and help companies to have a more accessible environment. So I talk to them about how they can make interviews, the recruitment process, the workplace more accessible. And another big topic that I try and portray in all of my talks is that individuals should never let their circumstances hold them back from what they want to achieve. Because, even though I had some absolutely terrible times in school that I would never want anyone else to have to go through or experience, I'm now using those, negative experiences positively, to positively, help and support and inspire other people. So the work that I do now is I basically go all over the country to every single kind of business, so law firms, banks. I go to schools, NHS trusts, councils, and deliver talks on my experiences of living and growing up on the autism spectrum. Because I want to use my experiences to help and inspire as many people as I can. And I feel that a lot of what I talk about, many people wouldn't feel comfortably sharing. And I'm quite happy to share anything really, even if it's something that was a negative experience for me or something that I might find difficult speaking about. I feel it's sort of really important to actually show people exactly what having autism is like.
It must be really satisfying work on a number of levels. One, because you're talking about yourself and you're using your negative experiences to bring positivity into other, and some of your positive experiences as well to bring positivity to other people. But also because, when you're talking to employers and other people like that about, how to improve the recruitment process, for example, or how to make the working environment more autism friendly, each talk that you give that they would never otherwise have access to has the potential to sort of transform the quality of life, the quality of working life, at least, of many, many people.
Yeah, it's I always say the work I do is it's so satisfying. I mean, I can't even put into words how much I enjoy the work that I do. I mean, I wake up every day like really looking forward to getting started on my work, and sometimes even on a Sunday, where most people might think, "Oh, I've got to go to work tomorrow," or "I've got to go to school," or wherever it may be. I'm on a Sunday thinking, "Oh, I wish it was Monday morning because I can't wait to get stuck into this project that I'm doing or get some more talks booked or arranged." So the work and it's so satisfying as well, because when I see how much, my talk or even just one element of my talk has impacted an individual so much, it's such a rewarding feeling. The amount of people I've had who after a talk will come up to me and say, "Oh, your experiences sound just like my son or just like my daughter," or one little thing that I've said has resonated with someone so much, and they can come to me and they'll say something like, "Oh, that um, coping strategy that you used would be so helpful for my son or my daughter. I'm going to try it with him when we get home." And it's just such a rewarding feeling knowing that I've impacted someone so much and I might be actually helping
Yeah.
individuals with their own challenges.
And it's perfect work for an autistic person because not only do you bring your own experiences, but it's meaningful work and it has a positive impact, which tend to be most important things for us. And I see that you're quite established with it. Your website is extremely professional. You seem to be very successful at what you do. How did you get established? Just briefly, how did you get established on this path?
So when I first left sixth form, one of the first things my dad did was he booked me onto a TV presenter training course because I wanted to be work in children's television, which is still a big ambition of mine. Um, and I thought to myself, right, how can I get experience in in like the media world, so like the TV and radio? So I thought, well, why don't I try and talk about on TV or radio something that I'm passionate or really knowledgeable on? So I decided to try and get some interviews on the radio and the TV talking about my experiences of living with autism. And once I'd, done a few radio interviews, written quite a few articles and things like that, I attended what was called the Autism Show. It's now called the Autism and ADHD Show. And I saw another individual speaking about his experiences. And I was so inspired by this individual that I thought, wow, I've spoken about these kind of topics on the radio and the TV before. I could do these kinds of talks to different companies and schools that he was doing. And that's what inspired me to then go away and start writing my first tour and sending emails out to companies, schools, universities to try and see if any of them would actually want me to come in and talk about my experiences to help their employees, to help their students, to help their colleagues. So that's kind of how I got started. It was through my love of wanting to kind of be in the media industry and be on television that, kickstarted me down this path of presenting talks for a living. And, I'd never have thought at the start that, I could actually be doing this as a full-time job, but it's something that I have made into my full-time career now. And I never want to stop doing it.
That's wonderful. And I look forward to one day soon seeing you as a TV presenter, children's TV presenter as well, alongside it.
Thank you.
Alex, it's been really wonderful talking to you. I've got 3 quick fire questions that I ask to every guest on the podcast. Before we go there, tell us a bit about where people can find out more about you if they'd like to.
So my website is www.thealexmanners.com. So you can go on there to find out more about my talks or any of the media outlets I've been in. I'm also on lots of social media channels. So I've got a YouTube channel, TikTok, Instagram. I'm big on LinkedIn as well. And you can either type in my name, which is Alex Manners, or I'm The Alex Manners. So my company is all one word, The Alex Manners. And then my book, called That's Not Right, My Life Living with Asperger's, is available to buy on Amazon.
Good. Thank you. Now, 3 quick fire questions. We talk about autism all the time, but there isn't a universally agreed definition of what it is. So in your understanding, what is autism?
So I always say to people that autism is a hidden disability that affects how we communicate with others and how we view and interact with the world around us. And everyone with autism is completely different. So no two people are the same. But there are lots of common traits that many individuals might have. And these include things like a love of routine, taking things literally, difficulties with processing language and reading jokes, facial expressions, and sarcasm, highly focused interests, high levels of stress, and becoming over or undersensitive to lots of sensory stimuli like smells, sounds, the feel of certain objects, or the taste of certain foods.
If you had only one piece of advice, one message to parents of autistic children, what would it be? What would be the one thing they would need to remember or to do?
I think focus on your child's strengths, focus on the things that they excel at, that they're really good at, and use those strengths as a way to help them overcome and manage some of the challenges that they faced. So my passion is with football and children's TV, and I've used that to help me to cope with lots of the challenges that I faced. So whatever your child is really passionate on or really good at, use those skills, use those interests to help them to manage the challenges that they might be facing.
And finally, in your perfect world, how is autism understood and integrated?
I think in my perfect world, um, reasonable adjustments, especially in the workplace or in school, would just be commonplace for everyone. One of my friends told me that the reason he hadn't told his workplace that he had a diagnosis of autism was because he said that, well, everything that I need has already been put in place. So there's never really been a need for me to tell anyone at work that I've got a diagnosis because everything I need is already put in place. And I think that's where we want to be getting to. That would be like the perfect world where, reasonable adjustments are just, and the things that we need are just put in place automatically. And I think also in the perfect world, um, everybody, when they start a new job, would have some form of autism training. I know you've got like the Oliver McGowan mandatory training for healthcare professionals, but I want to see other, sort of areas like teachers having to have mandatory autism training as well. So I think my perfect world when it comes to autism would be where everybody who gets a new job would have some form of specific autism training, and where reasonable adjustments are just commonplace and are just put in place regardless of what diagnosis you may or may not have.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alex. Been great to have you on the podcast.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.